So this lecture is about the fossil record, and basically kind of a brief history of what was the major events for throughout the evolution of early part of life. And then later on we'll talk more about prokaryotes and eukaryotes and such. Okay, so first of all, I'll just stop here for a second so you guys can take notes, or stop the video and take notes. But let's just kind of go through this stuff, okay? So the fossil record chronicles the life on Earth. Of course, it doesn't completely chronicle, and there are confusing points to it. In other words, as we talked about in Core 1, or probably you talked about in Core 1, there were times when, the Earth was like, especially in rocks, that rocks got turned over, or there were sediments, or rocks were broken down, etc. So it wasn't completely clear, but in general, it's fossilized. Things that can be fossilized are in the strata of rocks, with the most primitive things on the lower levels and the most advanced things on the top levels. All right. Some of the earliest life, of course, was mostly soft tissue, and so it didn't really leave remains that could be fossilized. So some of the earliest life is mostly just theorized about, but some of the things can be found in some forms, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Make sure that you read about fossil dating. I'm not going to cover that in lecture, but it is helpful to understand how fossil dating is occurring. I will not be testing you on that per se, all right? So don't worry about that. But it is good to, just kind of read it over and sort of look at how they might do that. And of course, these fossil remains then create a geologic record. So this is found in table 25.1. So let's just look at that. As you can see, it's kind of a big, busy table. And so I'm not going to go through every part of it. But one of the things to note is that there were sort of general, what they call epochs or eras, in which different things occurred, and these would be considered the most primitive. And then there were different groups of times when different types of organisms appeared, of course this being the most modern up here. All right, so take a look at that geologic record. It's interesting to note the different times. This of course is kind of what we're talking about now, this time when things were not real known about, but we do know some basic facts. So we will go over what those things are. And then as life developed, you got more of these types of things. Okay, so what we are thinking is that, is that as prokaryotes evolved, of course, that they exploited and changed the young Earth. Prokaryotes, you might recall, are organisms that are single-celled, and they have a cell wall nowadays, but they might not have had a cell wall then. So they have just the cell membrane per se, and they have the cytoplasm, which is the fluid inside the cell, and they have polymers that are inside the cell, and they have self-replicating molecules. So that's what we were talking about in the last lecture. And they have some other features, present day ones, but perhaps at this point they were just that, right? So they're very simple, and compared to eukaryotes, of course, which are more complex because they have many membrane-bound structures in their cytoplasm, all right? So one thing that they do know is that the Earth formed and solidified about 4.5 billion years ago. Now the whole universe is thought to be about 15 billion years old. So this is, as the theory goes, is as the clouds of matter were swirling, that things ran into each other, they coalesced, they became the different bodies that we see in the universe today, including the planets. And those, the Earth then was formed and solidified. Was it in exactly the same orbit? They theorized perhaps, and at that point, of course, it didn't really have an atmosphere or anything like that. So the first part of the first 3/4 really of the evolutionary history of the Earth, and when life started to form, it was all going to be unicellular organisms. So one thing that they knew was that the Earth was bombarded by space trash. There was no atmosphere for it to be reflected off of or bounced off of, and therefore the heat was probably very high, and therefore water could be vaporized. In other words, the condensation or dehydration synthesis could occur. And this was thought to have ended about 3.9 billion years ago when the seas formed. All right, so then the evolution of life started when the seas, probably most likely right around this time when the seas were forming, because you had then plenty of water, you had some other molecules that were just floating around, and if you had plenty of heat and electricity, then you get what O'Perrin and Haldane and Miller and so forth were talking about, Yuri. All right, so the oldest rock is about 3.8 billion years old. So in other words, the rock that exists today as part of the geologic plates was not really formed until then. And this the oldest rock that they've ever found is in Greenland. And the first fossils were about 3.5 billion years ago. So let's look at a couple of overheads. First of all, this one is showing you, so this is a fairly nice one that is showing you kind of the general periods of time, sort of in a clockwise way. So I'll back up so you can kind of look at that. All right, so one of the first things to note is the origin of the Earth, which again was 4.5 billion years ago. And it wasn't until, so the prokaryotes are the yellow, that we just said, that it wasn't until about 3.9 or 3.8 billion years ago that the prokaryotes started forming. And then it wasn't until much later, about let's see, what is this, three and a half, not quite 3.5, when photosynthesis started to occur. So this was most likely cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria would then start producing oxygen, and that would really start the formation of the atmosphere. So oxygen production. And prokaryotes up to that point might have been also producing carbon dioxide. So these are gases that are the major part of the atmosphere, as well as nitrogen gas, of course. Okay, so nitrogen gas would be gases that are produced from their physiological processes. All right, and then later single-celled eukaryotes would come about a little over 2 billion years ago, all right? And then after that, we get multicellular organisms, and then we're going up into the current events. All right, so that's just a little bit about the history. Another thing that is kind of nice to keep in mind is that as the Earth was forming, or as the rock was forming, as we said about 3.8 billion years ago, it was all one landmass that existed, and the rest of the Earth was ocean, or that is water. So that is why, you have to consider that the oceans have the most diversity of life, because of course that's where life evolved. And most likely they talk about how organisms most likely evolved in the ocean and moved to land as land masses became where they were. So in other words, through the periods of time, the land masses changed, and as the land masses, in other words, they moved apart from each other, tectonic plates, etc. And as they moved apart from each other and became in their current position, the ecological situations on each of those land masses was quite a bit different, right? So that, where it's the warmest, of course, which is, around the equator, of course, is where most of the life is going to exist. But there may have been, and if you look really closely, there may have been some areas that used to be warmer and then they weren't, right? Because they migrated to different parts of the Earth's surface. So that's something to consider when we're talking about like how things evolve, all right? So prokaryotes dominated at first, and remember that, prokaryotes and eukaryotes are inherently different because eukaryotes have membrane-bound everything. They have a nucleus and they have endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, etc. And there are two major groups, though, of prokaryotes. There are bacteria and archaea. We will talk more about them later and what their differences are. But these were thought to have been some of the first groups. And many were found. So remember how I said they weren't found in the fossil record, but they could find remains in microbial mats called strombolates, which are basically kind of fossilized mats of these materials. And so because it was so massive, they actually could see some of that. And also they were thought to have formed near hydrothermal vents, which is that primordial pizza thing that I gave you. It talks about those and what's happening there, but these are vents in the ocean created from the tectonic plate action, and also a possible place where life could have been formed because of the heat and hydrogen sulfides that are part of that. All right. So as photosynthesis started to occur, it was thought cyanobacteria were probably the first photosynthetic organisms. To do photosynthesis, you also had to have ATP synthesis. Of course, ATP is going to allow other molecules to be made, and that is allow for the actual function internally in a cell, the creation of molecules, the moving of things from here to there, etc. And the ETC is not etc. The ETC is the electron transport chain. So to do photosynthesis, you also had to have the electron transport chain. It may not have been in a chloroplast, and probably wasn't. It was probably just across the membrane of a cyanobacteria. Now you might recall talking about this maybe in Core 1. I know I do in my class, but maybe you guys don't. But remember that the chloroplast and the mitochondria were thought to have been single-celled organisms that were doing either ATP synthesis, right, or the electron transport chain. Single-celled organisms that were doing that, and in some cases, in the case of the chloroplast, they could have been a single-celled organism that was doing photosynthesis as well, were basically engulfed by other organisms. So one of the theories is that as oxygen went up, the conditions for the early prokaryotes became less favorable, and that made the eukaryotes go up. In other words, these organisms actually hid out inside of other organisms, and therefore the eukaryote was created.